Welcome to WW2 Heroic Tales, where true stories of courage, sacrifice, and extraordinary heroism come alive from the darkest days of World War II. Join us as we uncover the untold moments that shaped history. The year is 1943. The fate of the world hangs precariously in the balance. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the North Atlantic, a brutal, silent war rages. This is the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous military campaign of World War II. Here, fleets of German U-boats, the infamous wolf packs, prowl the depths, their mission simple and savage: to sever the Allied lifeline. Every ship carrying troops, food, fuel, and weapons from North America to Great Britain is a target. For the Allies, losing this battle means losing the war. Into this maelstrom sails the United States Army transport Dorchester. She is not a warship. Originally a coastal liner built in 1926 for the Merchants and Miners Transportation Company, the Dorchester was a vessel of peace, designed for comfort, not combat. Acquired by the War Shipping Administration, she was hastily converted for military service. At 368 feet long, with a single screw propeller pushing her to a sluggish top speed of around 12 knots, she was slow, old, and vulnerable. Her hull was thin, lacking the compartmentalization and armor of a purpose-built naval vessel. She was, in essence, a steel coffin waiting for a predator. The journey she was undertaking was one of the most dangerous on Earth, a treacherous route through an area known as Torpedo Alley. The winter seas were monstrous, with gale-force winds whipping up waves that could toss the ship like a toy. Icebergs were a constant threat, but the greatest danger lurked unseen beneath the churning, gray surface. This hostile environment, a battlefield of ice, water, and steel, would become the stage for one of the most profound acts of human courage in the entire war. Aboard the Dorchester, among the hundreds of young soldiers bound for the European theater, were four men whose destinies were about to intertwine. They were Army chaplains, men of God from starkly different backgrounds, united by a common purpose. First Lieutenant George L. Fox was a Methodist minister from Vermont. A husband and father of two, he was no stranger to war. He had served as a medical corps assistant in World War I, earning the Silver Star, the Purple Heart, and the French Croix de Guerre for his bravery under fire. He was a quiet, resolute man, re-enlisting a day after the attack on Pearl Harbor despite being over the age requirement. Then there was First Lieutenant Alexander D. Good, a rabbi from Washington, D.C., an exceptional scholar with a Ph.D. from Johns Hopkins University. Good was a charismatic leader, athlete, and devoted family man. He left behind his wife and young daughter, believing it was his sacred duty to serve his country and offer spiritual comfort to soldiers of all faiths. First Lieutenant John P. Washington was a Catholic priest from Newark, New Jersey. Energetic and deeply committed to his community, Father Washington was known for his tireless work with youth groups. He had a reputation as a man who could connect with anyone, his faith a source of strength and inspiration for all who knew him. Finally, there was First Lieutenant Clark V. Poling, a Dutch Reformed minister from Schenectady, New York. His father was a nationally known radio evangelist. Before shipping out, Poling had a chilling conversation with his father, telling him not to pray for his safe return. He reportedly said, "Pray only that I shall do my duty, that I shall be adequate." These four men had met and bonded at the Army's chaplain school at Harvard University, forging a deep respect for one another's beliefs. On the cold, damp decks of the Dorchester, their interfaith friendship was a small beacon of unity in a world tearing itself apart. On January 23, 1943, the USAT Dorchester steamed out of New York Harbor, packed with over 900 souls. After a stop in St. John's, Newfoundland, it joined convoy SG-19, a small, slow convoy bound for the Army command base in Greenland. The Dorchester was the largest vessel in the group. The mood on board was a mixture of anxiety, youthful bravado, and homesickness. These were mostly young men, many of whom had never been to sea, heading toward an unknown fate in a foreign land. The North Atlantic winter was relentless. The air was frigid, the decks coated in a treacherous layer of ice. Below decks, the converted liner was overcrowded and stuffy. For many, seasickness was a constant misery. In this tense and uncomfortable environment, the Four Chaplains were a constant presence. They moved through the ship, their very demeanor a calming influence. They organized religious services, catering to their respective congregations, but they also simply walked the decks, talking to the soldiers. They listened to stories about families back home, shared jokes, played cards, and offered words of encouragement. They handed out books and tried to lift the spirits of men grappling with fear and uncertainty. They made it clear that their ministry was not confined to their own denomination. They were there for every man on that ship, regardless of his faith. The convoy's only protection came from 3 U.S. Coast Guard cutters: the 250-foot Tampa, the 165-foot Escanaba, and the 165-foot Comanche. While valiant, this small escort was critically insufficient to defend against a determined U-boat attack, especially in a region where air cover was non-existent. The captain of the Dorchester, Hans J. Danielson, was aware of the danger. He had ordered the men to sleep in their clothes and keep their life jackets close at hand. But compliance was low. The jackets were bulky and uncomfortable, and the constant state of alert had led to a sense of complacency. As the Dorchester plowed through the dark, icy waves, a silent hunter was already closing in. Beneath the waves, in the crushing silence of the deep, German submarine US-223 was on the prowl. Commanded by Captain Lieutenant Carl Eugen Wechter, US-223 was a Type VIIC U-boat, the workhorse of the Kriegsmarine's submarine fleet. At 220 feet long, it was a marvel of deadly efficiency, but for its crew of around 45 men, it was a cramped, foul-smelling steel tube. The air was thick with the stench of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and cooking fumes. Privacy was non-existent. Life was a monotonous cycle of watch-standing, maintenance, and brief periods of rest, all conducted in the eerie glow of the boat's internal lighting. The tension, however, was palpable. Every ping of a distant sonar, every unexpected noise, could signal their discovery and death. Webster and his crew were seasoned hunters. Using sophisticated hydrophones, they could detect the faint, rhythmic sound of a convoy's propellers from miles away. Once a target was acquired, the hunt began. It was a cold, calculated process. Webster would shadow the convoy, staying submerged during the day and surfacing under the cover of darkness to use his U-boat's superior surface speed to get ahead of the slow-moving merchant ships. He was waiting for the opportune moment, a lapse in the escort screen, a clear shot at a high-value target. From the periscope, the Dorchester would have appeared as a large, dark silhouette against the night sky. She was slow, unmaneuverable, and packed with enemy soldiers. A perfect target. Inside USAT 223, the atmosphere would have shifted from tense monotony to focused excitement. The torpedo room crew would be making their final checks. The navigator would be calling out bearings and distances. Webster, his eye pressed to the periscope, would be making the final calculations, factoring in the target's speed, the angle of the shot, and the torpedo's run time. The order would be given: Fire 1, Fire 2. With a shudder and a hiss of compressed air, the deadly eels would be on their way, their small propellers churning silently through the black water, closing the distance to their unsuspecting target. It happened at 12:55 a.m. on February 3, 1943. The Dorchester was approximately 100 miles off the coast of Greenland. The sea was calm, but the air temperature was just above freezing, and the water was a lethal 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Most of the 904 men aboard were asleep in their bunks, lost in dreams of home. In the control room of USAT 223, Captain Lieutenant Webster gave the order to fire. A G-7E electric torpedo, running silent and wakeless, sped through the dark water. The impact was catastrophic. The torpedo struck the Dorchester on the starboard side, deep below the waterline, tearing a massive hole in the ship's hull near the boiler room and engine spaces. The explosion was a deep, gut-wrenching roar that ripped through the vessel. Men were thrown from their bunks. The steel structure of the ship screamed in protest. Immediately, the ship's electrical systems were destroyed, plunging the interior into absolute, terrifying darkness. The boilers exploded, sending scalding steam and ammonia gas billowing through the compartments below deck. The ship lost all power and began to list heavily, almost immediately, to starboard. Water, colder than ice, surged into the breached hull with incredible force, flooding the lower decks in seconds. Panic erupted. In the pitch black, smoke-filled corridors, disoriented and terrified men scrambled to find a way out. The ship's tilt made movement nearly impossible. Ladders were now angled walls. Doors were jammed shut. The sounds were a symphony of hell, the groaning of twisting metal, the hiss of escaping steam, the roar of the incoming sea, and the desperate cries of the wounded and trapped. Many men died in the initial blast. Many more were trapped below decks, their escape routes cut off by fire, debris, or the immediate, overwhelming flood of Arctic water. The ship, which had been a floating city of hope just moments before, was now a sinking tomb. On the bridge, Captain Danielson knew his ship was doomed. He gave the order to abandon ship, but the chaos and lack of power made an organized evacuation impossible. Out of the blackness and chaos, four figures emerged, not with weapons or orders, but with an unshakable calm that seemed to defy the unfolding horror. Chaplains Fox, Good, Washington, and Poling had been jolted awake like everyone else, but their training and their faith immediately took over. They did not rush for their own safety. Instead, they moved toward the danger, toward the sounds of fear and pain. Working together, they began to move through the listing, smoke-choked passageways. Their voices, steady and reassuring, cut through the din of panic. They were not shouting commands. They were speaking to individual men, calming their fears and guiding them toward the lifeboats on the upper decks. Their presence was a steadying force in a world that had been turned upside down. On the sloping deck, the scene was one of utter pandemonium. Lifeboats were tangled, frozen to their davits, or had been damaged in the explosion. Overcrowded boats capsized as they were lowered, spilling their occupants into the deadly water. Men, paralyzed by fear, stood frozen at the rails, unwilling to jump into the black, icy abyss. The chaplains went to work. They found the locker where the spare life jackets were stored and began distributing them. They moved methodically, handing a jacket to one man, helping another put his on correctly, and pushing a third toward a viable lifeboat. Survivor accounts paint a vivid picture of their actions. Private William Bednar remembered falling on the deck and a chaplain helping him up, telling him, "Stay calm." Private John Ladd saw the chaplains guiding men who were too stunned to move. They were not preaching or proselytizing, they were serving. They helped the wounded, offering what little comfort they could. Their interfaith bond, forged in the quiet halls of Harvard, was now being tested by fire and ice, and it was holding strong. They worked as a single unit, their different faiths irrelevant in the face of their shared humanity. In the darkest moment, these four men became beacons of hope, their courage a stark contrast to the terror that surrounded them. The supply of life jackets in the storage locker was quickly exhausted. As the Dorchester listed more severely, preparing for its final plunge, a terrible realization set in. There were still dozens of young soldiers on deck without a life jacket, their faces etched with the certainty of a horrifying death. For a man in the 34-degree North Atlantic, survival without flotation was impossible, and even with it, life expectancy was measured in mere minutes. In that moment, surrounded by the screams of the dying and the groaning of the ship, the four chaplains faced a choice. They could save themselves, or they could live out the very essence of their faith. What happened next was witnessed by the survivors and became the heart of their legend. Without a word exchanged between them, as if guided by a single divine impulse, they made their decision. First Lieutenant George Fox, the decorated veteran of World War I, turned to a terrified young soldier, took off his own life jacket and placed it on the man's shoulders. Then Rabbi Alexander Good did the same, offering his life vest to another soldier. Father John Washington followed suit, calmly removing his jacket and securing it on someone else. Finally, Reverend Clark Poling, the young minister who had asked his father to pray only that he would be adequate, performed the same selfless act. Survivors who witnessed these moments were stunned into silence. One survivor, Engineer Grady Clark heard one of the chaplains say something to the effect of, "It is a far better thing that I do this." Another witness recalled a soldier protesting, and a chaplain responding that he had his faith and was not afraid to meet his God. Each act was a quiet, personal transaction, an offering of life itself. In giving away their only means of survival, the four men were making the ultimate statement of their beliefs. Their love for their fellow man was greater than their fear of death. They were demonstrating, in the most profound way imaginable, that there is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. The USAT Dorchester was dying. The ship's bow rose high into the air as the stern slipped beneath the waves. The angle of the deck became impossibly steep. Men and debris slid down the slanting steel into the frigid sea. The ship had been struck at 12:55 a.m. By 1:20 a.m., less than 30 minutes later, it was gone. In those final, chaotic moments, the survivors who were already in the water, clinging to life rafts and wreckage, looked back at the sinking vessel. What they saw would be seared into their memories for the rest of their lives. There, on the high, slanting deck, stood the four chaplains. Their work of saving others was done. Now, with no life jackets and no hope of escape, they braced themselves against the railing. They linked their arms together, the Methodist, the rabbi, the priest, and the Reformed minister, a living testament to unity. As the ship slid beneath the waves, they did not scream or cry out. Instead, they prayed. Survivors in the water just yards away could hear their voices carrying across the black water. They were praying aloud, not in panic, but with a serene and powerful dignity. Witnesses reported hearing prayers in English, Latin, and Hebrew, a chorus of faith rising above the noise of the sinking. They were singing hymns, their voices joined as one. They were offering final words of comfort, not for themselves, but for the men dying around them and for the souls of those already lost. They stood as one, four brothers in faith, facing death together. This was their final sermon, delivered not with words from a pulpit, but with their very lives on the deck of a sinking ship. The image of the four chaplains, arms linked, praying as they went down with the ship, became the enduring symbol of their sacrifice. It was a moment of profound grace amidst unimaginable horror, a final act of courage that transformed a military disaster into an immortal story of faith and heroism. When the Dorchester vanished, an eerie silence fell over the sea, broken only by the cries of the men in the water. For them, the ordeal was far from over. They were adrift in an ocean that was actively trying to kill them. The 34-degree water temperature was a more relentless foe than the U-boat. It leached the heat from their bodies with shocking speed. The cold was so intense it felt like burning. Muscles cramped, minds became clouded, and within minutes, unconsciousness and death from hypothermia would claim them. The rescue was frantic. The Coast Guard cutter Escanaba arrived on the scene first, its crew horrified by the sight of hundreds of men, many already dead, floating in the debris field. They threw nets over the side and lowered crewmen in harnesses into the freezing water to physically haul survivors aboard. The cutter Comanche joined the effort, sweeping its searchlights across the dark water, illuminating a scene of terrible carnage. The rescuers worked with desperate urgency, pulling men from the water who were so frozen their limbs were rigid. Many who were pulled aboard alive would die later from the effects of extreme hypothermia. The final tally was grim. Of the 904 people aboard the Dorchester, only 230 survived. 674 men, soldiers, civilian contractors, and crew perished in the icy North Atlantic. In the aftermath, as the survivors thawed out and began to process the horror they had endured, a single, consistent story emerged. They spoke of the Four Chaplains. They credited them not just with providing the life jackets that directly saved some of them, but with providing the spiritual strength that saved many more. Their calm in the face of chaos had prevented a total breakdown of discipline. Their courage had inspired others to fight for their lives, to help their comrades, to not give up hope. The men saved by the chaplain's own life vests knew they were alive because of a direct act of sacrifice. The legend of the Four Chaplains was born not in a press release, but in the hushed, grateful testimonies of the men who had witnessed their final, heroic moments. News of the sinking and the chaplain's extraordinary bravery eventually reached the United States, sending a ripple of awe and inspiration across a nation at war. In an era defined by division and conflict, the story of a Methodist, a Jew, a Catholic, and a Protestant sacrificing themselves together for their fellow men was an incredibly powerful message of unity. It transcended religious boundaries and spoke to the core values the country was fighting for. The actions of the four men were widely recognized as being among the most heroic of the war. They were posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and the Purple Heart. A special medal was sought for them, the Medal of Honor, but military regulations at the time stipulated it could only be awarded for heroism performed under fire. While the torpedo attack was an act of combat, the chaplain's specific actions were not in direct engagement with the enemy. Unwilling to let their sacrifice go unrecognized at the highest level, Congress took an unprecedented step. On July 14, 1960, a special act of Congress created the Four Chaplains Medal, a unique award intended to have the same weight and importance as the Medal of Honor. It was presented posthumously to their next of kin by the Secretary of the Army. The medal has never been awarded again. The legacy of the Four Chaplains was further immortalized in 1951 with the dedication of the Chapel of Four Chaplains in Philadelphia. The Interfaith Chapel serves as a national shrine, its centerpiece a magnificent painting depicting their final moments on the deck of the Dorchester. On February 3rd each year, Four Chaplains Day is observed across the United States, with ceremonies at military bases, veterans' halls, and houses of worship. The story of their sacrifice has become a timeless parable of selfless courage and interfaith brotherhood, a reminder that in the ultimate test, humanity and love can triumph over fear and death. Thank you for joining WW2 Heroic Tales. Through the stories of brave souls from World War II, we honor their memory and keep their legacy alive for history and generations to come.